Hello, lovelies. So housekeeping first. Still feeling quite affected by the loss of James Carpio. He did write some stuff for Gore for me, and is one of the few other people working and speaking at the intersection of sex and kink and RPGs, so it does feel very lonely out here now. And given my brush with death in recent years, it makes you a bit morbid, a bit pensive, I suppose. Question things, approaches, risk taking, things like that. It's been a bit of a introspective week or so. Running, I'm concretely saying that I'm going to launch a crowdfunder for that in March of next year, which gives me more time to put a bunch of stuff together. I've made an early version of just the text available to people to go over. If you want to be one of them, hit me up on email or privately on social media, and you'll have the chance to give me some feedback on what you think on that. What else has been going on? Did some more stuff for the OGGM, so our partnership continues. His Seth gear and ammo catalogue for Halloween is up. How long he's going to be able to keep these things up, I don't know. But I think we're going to slowly transition that to more of a zine format, rather than just a catalogue of stuff for D20 compatible games, and we'll see how that goes. I think his humour shines through a bit better in this one. I think he's got one planned for Christmas, so he's keeping me busy with layout, which is the thing I hate to do the most. There's also a Goblin Punk thing for Shadow Dark, which will also be coming out soon. I've started on the layout of that. This Sunday, after various illnesses, computer explosions, and other problems, we should be back on our role-playing schedule for streaming games over on Grim Streams, and I believe on paper I'm down to run Dragonbane on Sunday. So we'll be doing that, hopefully. There's a conversation that's kind of stuck with me over the week with Rhino Watcher, one of the regular commentators, one of the ones like Liberal Hyena who's constantly aggravating me. We got stuck into a conversation about the idea of scarcity in Cyberpunk Red as opposed to Cyberpunk 2020 and so on. Many people have noted that the pay rates for jobs and so on in Cyberpunk Red are ludicrously low. And certainly there's the flavoured text there that things are harder to find and get hold of. But it's not necessarily reflected in the rules, at least not to my reading. There is this whole sort of subsection on night markets and things, which harks back to the origin of the name Night City and its roots in Gibson's work. But that shopping is tedious in any game, pretty much, and turning it into a random grab bag assortment that you have to role play through every shopping trip. This is not progress. This is not something that most people are going to want to waste a lot of time on. It's something that you might run into during a game when someone needs to get their hands on something now, and have to go around. Then it becomes a scene in a game. In downtime and so on, not so much. I mean, the rules even say that fixers and even normal people, there's what you can find easily depending on your streetwise capability and your fixer special ability. But you can find anything given enough time. So presumably in downtime, given enough time and money, you can find anything. But Rhino seems particularly fixated on this as being some sort of be-all and end-all of the setting, and I just don't see it. It seems like a weird fixation to me to fixate upon this one specific subsystem. I'm wondering if there's any other examples of people getting weird fixations on one particular subsystem of a setting. To me, I mean, they say it's like ignoring hit points in D&D, but I say it's more like reading the chase subsystem for skills in an RPG and thinking the entire game is about parkour and chases. It's just odd to me. But I was wondering if anyone has any other examples of where people have gotten caught up in particular subsystems and things and can't see the wood for the trees. Anyway, on the Orkan video, Mateus says, with Orkan, 6 More Vodka just flat out admits they make best in business concept art but utterly shitty games. This product is basically a cry for help out to anyone interested in making it into a game, which is fair. Many companies have great lore but shitty games and do nothing. Best example is Games Workshop's 140k. I mean, their success suggests that there's more to it than just great lore. Mind you, I haven't touched a 40k skirmish game in a war game in a while. No, I have touched the skirmish game. Their combat patrol thing, whose name escapes me currently. But I didn't think the Genesis was bad. Certainly the newer edition that they came out with later, it seemed more that they just didn't get on with the role-playing community. I think maybe their expectations were too high for what they could get out of the RPG industry, especially as a non-Anglo company. And I think they got burned a bit because some of their rules didn't make sense in the earlier edition. But it's not that they were bad at it. I mean, Wizards of the Coast is bad at it. They're very successful. But just Orkan, it's a weird project. It feels like a role-playing game without a game attached. But if they're looking for someone to write a game for it, I'm available. PNPTCN on the same video says, what a way to resurrect the noble savage trope. Good intentions and all that, I guess. Yeah, that's the flip side, isn't it? The one good thing that W gave us, or I guess the speechwriter gave us, was the phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. I guess we should try and deal with reality as it is, and trying to rehabilitate what you might call uncivilized peoples and their weird and inhumane ways is a weird way to look at things, especially when you apply it to fictional beings. So I will never get it. Loki Takahashi says, honestly, same. Humanized orcs. The what if this group wasn't evil angle, and everyone and their mother latching onto it. Sometimes better and more entertaining writing is where the drow are just evil, power-hungry, ritualistic, cultish monsters. The orcs are horrible roaming hordes that raid and pillage. And looking into these evil races and their culture is far more interesting. Yeah, even if it's just what's evil from a human point of view. Right? So why are the drow a vicious dominatrixy matriarchy? How can we understand that? Why are they setting out to reform them? Why are orcs? Why is their culture so heavily based on raiding, like the Mongols or the Vikings? And why are there so many half orcs? And you can go down some interesting, if dark, paths trying to understand why orc culture might be the way that it is. I mean, you can always use gods and religion. That tends to make even the nicest people commit atrocities. But what if it's deeper? What if it's rooted in some biology or something else? What if it's rooted in the harshness of the landscape they come from and the scarcity that they live in? Yeah, those sorts of things. Understanding why something might be evil from the viewpoint of humans, if not necessarily internally to them, yeah, that's far more interesting. That's the shade of grey that I would like to go for, you know? I mean, if they were capable of such higher thought, caterpillars would probably think ichneumon wasps were evil, but to the wasp, they're just doing what they have evolved to do to survive. So it's all a matter of perspective. Moral relativism doesn't mean necessarily banishing the idea of evil. It's just understanding that it's from a certain point of view. On the Advanced Fighting Fantasy review, Skalka says, good to see someone else who didn't get into RPGs via D&D. I remember those Steve Jackson books. They were pretty cool to loan from the school library. My first RPGs were Mech Warrior, first edition, along with Battletech and Marvel Superheroes. Some great nostalgia in those. Yep. Definitely. And I do think anyone who manages to escape from starting with D&D somehow, escapes that role-playing gravity well, tends to have a far broader, better, more interesting experience and life in RPGs than people who did start via D&D and never got out of its clutches. I think it does make a big difference. On the Electric State, Truffle says, the 90s, thank you. I was saying something very similar to my housemate, right back to the 1920s and 10s a week or so ago. That favourite Doctor Who spin-off fiction I've spoken of before was published in the 90s. It too talked about the incredible rate of progress in human non-alien society until there was a sudden stop and seeming regression to human sociology, on track to things like uploading and post-scarcity, until all that progress stopped. Technology became more incremental rather than the exponential progress, and post-humanity took so very long to reach that post-human stage. I still can't understand why cyberspace and VR just aren't so popular, even as a story or gaming concept anymore. Yeah, it does. I wonder if it feels like it to younger people, but to older people, I think it feels like progress is kind of stymied, and yeah, it's incremental. It's each new version of the smartphone. It's an increase in resolution on TVs and maybe color depth. Physical media has kind of halted at the Blu-ray, really. And I wonder if young people have a better sense. I mean, you can talk about the TikTok generation, but that's just Vine. Different versions of the same kind of thing. Innovations are incremental. Even social media, which is so dominant in the landscape, it's just MySpace remixed. And so it goes, I guess. As to why cyberspace and VR aren't so popular as a story or gaming concept anymore, I think it's ironically because we've kind of tried them and we now can acknowledge and see that they don't really work. So VR is fun, but it is a toy. You need space in which to use it properly, or you're going to be bumping into things, and space is at a premium for a lot of people in technologically advanced nations, the US being an exception, but with property prices being what they are, particularly in urban settings where people have access to fast internet, still a bit of an issue. I think we feel vulnerable when we're locked into VR in a way that we don't when we're staring into a laptop or whatever. It makes us helpless, and that is an uncomfortable position to be in. It's kind of like being asleep. So I think we feel vulnerable. I also think we've shown that outside of some very specific applications, delving into VR just isn't that useful. It's not any faster or better to negotiate a file system in a virtual reality representation than it is to click on folders. So, yeah, it seems like a lot of computer power and faff and VR headsets and everything else, it's just not worth it. Plus, it makes us uncomfortable. Plus, it costs more money for a toy that we don't use most of the time, and all of these things. Now, augmented reality, since it integrates with and enhances the reality around us, that I can see working. And so eventually, I guess we're going to crack augmented reality glasses that work worth a damn, or contacts that work worth a damn. And so that will probably jump over VR and straight into AR, I think, because it doesn't leave us feeling vulnerable, because we're not locked into a headset and everything else. And it will provide useful, life-enhancing things all around us every day. So I think that's where things will go. VR is going to remain limited in its usefulness and its applicability. It's like 3D TV. It's not really much of a value add, especially if you have to wear goggles or special lenses or whatever else. You know, they keep trying, just like they keep trying with VR, but it never really reaches escape velocity. Liberal Hyena says, for what it's worth, the accent on the first A in the artist-author's name, referring to who I called Simon Stallenhag, name modifies the sound to or, serving the same function as the double A in Kierkegaard, who, as you doubtless recall, was referenced in recent discussion, also required my intervention in the interest of factual accuracy. There is, of course, no reason why you should have known this, given that you presumably have not studied Swedish. No, just a bit of Finnish. As I did for reasons that remain somewhat obscure even to myself. Finally, before I forget again, I've been wondering whether you plan to review Mothership in its new boxed edition. The Kickstarter was fulfilled a few months ago. Well, I did not back the Kickstarter, so I do not know if the boxed set is available for general purchase yet. And I just haven't been that interested in Mothership for whatever reason. So I went checking to see how you're supposed to pronounce Stallenhag. And various people seem to disagree. Some say it's more like Stollenhag, and some seem to think it's like the German fruity bread Stollenhag. So those are my attempts at pronouncing it properly. I will now revert to pronouncing it improperly, because I'm English, damn it, and that's what we do, even more so than Americans. On my Why Games Matter video, you all made me very, very uncomfortable with your praise of that video for the most part. So there were a lot of comments which I'm not going to go into because they make me feel icky. Yeah, I'm very, very weirdly sensitive about sounding pretentious or taking things too seriously. And I loosened those bounds a bit on that video, and you all responded very positively, which, as I say, makes me feel icky. I blame being bullied for being somewhat smart and reading and knowing how to do maths and stuff at school, and having somewhat esoteric interests at school which nobody else understood. It all made me very, very sensitive about revealing my interests and my pretensions, and as I say, taking things too seriously. But if you want me to be more pretentious and produce more pretentious videos, let me know what you'd like to hear me talk about, because that was from a prompt from a viewer. So comments. Bob Hill says, absolutely adore your longer videos. Every time I get the chance to hear from your deep well of ideas on the hobby, I always see it in a new and better light. So see what I mean? You're making me cringe. I'm not used to praise. I'm not good with it. Hunraku says, okay, no judgment, but did you use AI to help you write this? I think it's totally okay if you did, but I just kept thinking I detected something in the structure of the essay. No, I did not. Is that praise? I don't know. I have nothing ideologically really against AI. I find much of the reaction to it to be Ludditism and reminiscent of how people used to throw a fit about Photoshop back in the day, because I'm old. But yeah, no, I didn't. But I wouldn't be above doing so to help me get past a writer's block or something, or to throw up some ideas. Liberal Hyena says, unrelated, another question that won't let me sleep. Is 2000 AD worth £3.80 for 32 pages? Most of the content of which is as flimsy as the paper. I have a family to support, albeit in roadblocks. No, I did answer in text, but I'll answer here in case anyone's interested. I've been reading 2000 AD since I was about 3 years old, so I'm just missing the first few years. And I've been collecting it that entire time, and the magazine. I mostly still buy it for reasons of nostalgia and completionism and stubbornness. It is very hit and miss these days. And, talking about flimsy paper, it used to be printed on what was left over on the rolls from printing local newspapers. So the modern paper is not flimsy, in my experience. But there is very little that rises to the level of the greats from the past. There just isn't much that does that. Occasionally there's something. Judge Dredd is still reasonably consistent and does sometimes come up with something good and new. With Rogue Trooper, they've kind of gone back to the good old days of that. It's hit and miss, but it's more hit than miss these days than the times they tried to reinvent it. Feral and Foe is good. The magazine is consistently better than 2000 AD, I think, just because the world of Judge Dredd primarily is an endless wellspring of ideas and interpretations. But yeah, I feel your pain. I often don't feel like it's worth it anymore. It's unfortunate. I don't know what the je ne sais quoi is that's missing, but we need British comics to create people like Milligan and McCarthy, to nurture talents like Alan Moore, like Grant Morrison, like many of the artists who then have graduated to American comics and trade paperbacks and graphic novels and things. Though with the comic industry as a whole kind of collapsing, I do wonder how viable 2000 AD remains. I mean, compared to American comics, right, it's fucking Leonardo da Vinci, even on a bad day. So, yeah, there's that. Okay, I've posted that in the wrong place in my notes. So, let's come back to that, shall we? Okay. Also on the Electric State. This is the one I've posted out of order. I do apologise. Beetle just says, I can finally agree with your criticisms about the Year Zero engine. That was very well articulated. That's why I prefer their step dice version. Yeah, and I kind of alluded to that in the review, that it might be better to switch to using one of the other interpretations of their Year Zero engine for most of their Year Zero games. Beetle just also goes on to say, this series of games is so beautiful and nicely done, the stuff based on Stollenhag's work, but I guess because I'm not from Europe, I don't get its vibe. It looks more nostalgic than survival horror, in my opinion. It's not just European, like it's Northern European, and that is its own whole vibe as well. But I think a lot of his work has this kind of hangover-y feel from Cold War Europe, which felt much more immediate and threatening and dangerous to us through proximity to the Soviet Union and everything. And our media at the time was all much more realistic about our prospects given nuclear war and so on. So I think, yeah, it is nostalgia more than survival horror. Particularly, Tales from the Loop is much more nostalgic. Things from the Flood is slightly more horror, but still mostly nostalgic. The Electric State is leaning more towards the survival horror, and then I have bought Labyrinth, the art book. Whether there'll be an RPG, we don't know, probably, and that is much more rooted in survival horror. So there's like a progression from nostalgia to horror, which is interesting, which kind of reflects sometimes how we look back on our childhoods. You know, we start off feeling nostalgic, and then as we realise some of the darker shit that was going on in the background, perhaps we get a little bit more horrified. I did a retrospective on my Matchwoman with Guns D20 work for Mongoose Publishing, so I had a couple of comments on that. Simon says, I just checked drive-through, it looks like this game's been cancelled. Yeah, I guess they withdrew Matchwoman D20, but if you go to your drive-through account and make sure it's checked so that you can see adult content, that might be the issue. Simon also said it's a shame the D20 art was so bad compared to the original. I think that's a little unfair. I mean, Matchwoman D20 was full colour. The old booklets were black and white. I do think, you know, it was intended as a comedy game, a joke game, not something necessarily that you could play, though I did write it as something to be played because I think that helps the joke in a lot of ways. But I don't think it was particularly highly valued as a product by Mongoose, putting it out. So they may have skimped a bit on that. It's a shame, but the art's fine for what it is, which is a joke game. On a very old video about the definitions of woke versus progressive, Rollo says, I agree 100%, but I believe when you say progressive, you mean classical liberal. When you say woke, you mean Marxist. That's what I was taking away from your explanation, especially when it came to Professor X and Magneto. No, there's nothing really Marxist about woke identity politics. The identity that Marxism addresses is that of rich versus poor, of worker versus parasite, if you will. And classical liberals aren't particularly progressive. Progressive up to a point in their pursuit of individual liberty, but regressive because if you don't step in to protect people's rights, they end up necessarily being exploited. So, yeah, but no. On the Discworld RPG preview, which we've seen, Rats of a Feather said, I think the safety tools are nice, especially for Discworld, and especially if the Watch is the example faction. The Watch touches on police brutality, racism, sexism, and, in the book Snuff, genocide and slavery. A lot of real-world issues some people don't want in their games. But Discworld tackled those things, so it's not particularly representative of Discworld if you specifically exclude those things because they make people slightly uncomfortable. Humour and satire being especially good ways to examine these topics. Right? So safety tools there are necessarily counterproductive to the presumed goal of wanting to play in Discworld as Discworld and to provide continuity to what's there. Wraithing says, it's the same old story. Buying a comedy RPG won't make anybody funny, even groups of thick around the waist, irreverent middle-aged men. Comedy RPGs can work on a good night, but it can be a bit forced and arduous, like trying to become jobbing Radio 4 gag writers. The focus can be more headache than joyous relaxation. I've looked through the quick start myself. By the looks of things, it's going to be a sumptuously attractive document, and it seems like it'll be faithful to the IP. Reckon I'll probably fence it on the Kickstarter, give up, and buy it in a few years' time for half price or less when they're losing the license. Cynical, but I approve. Comedy RPGs. I often say comedy and horror are the two hardest genres for RPGs. working with something in the background at the moment that is meant to be at least somewhat humorous. And yeah, that's a problem we're running into. Horror and comedy are easy in RPGs if you take a cheap shot, if you go for the knob gags and the potty humour and the slapstick, then it's easy. The other way I think that makes it easier to create a comedy RPG atmosphere is very, very structured comedy, which is what you see in Paranoia, which is probably the most successful comedy RPG of all time. Right, you know that everyone's going to be focused on killing each other over the slightest misspoken word. You have all the same story beats, like the briefing. You go to PLC and you have to fill out all the forms to get your equipment and deal with the nightmarish bureaucracy. You go to R&D to pick up your weird devices, which are all stupid and will probably kill you, but may prove useful in the adventure itself. And then the moment you start on the mission, you're all trying to do each other in. So yeah, that kind of structured comedy works. And I followed the Paranoia model after a fashion when I created Invaders. So that works. But yeah, otherwise it's difficult. Which is weird because out of character we're often laughing and making jokes around the table. So maybe it's just a matter of bringing that into the game in some way. You know, you don't have to be Terry Pratchett to play around in his world and have fun with it. You know, we certainly did. Lastly, on the Kalergi plan, Janie says there is a UN paper titled Replacement Migration, which was published on March 21st, 2000. You should check that out. Well, I did, but I am not immediately triggered by the word replacement. What they're talking about there is compensating for a reduction in population growth and the aging out of large cohorts by migration, immigrants. So it's not a plan to replace people, as in to actually displace the native population. It's just saying that we need more people to do these jobs and so on. We're going to be hitting an age issue soon and a population issue soon. There's nothing sinister about it. You should probably actually read the paper when you quote it at people. So I pointed this out and they said, lol, really? They wrote about it nearly 25 years ago and it's coming to fruition now, just like they wrote about Operation Lockstep before global lockdown. Well, that's called pandemic preparedness, and if more people had paid attention to it, COVID wouldn't have been nearly as bad. Often very clever people can see problems coming and make plans to deal with them. That doesn't mean they caused them, it means they saw it coming. So that'll do for today. Zang. I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there.